Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first Bartlett School of Planning public lecture in our series for this academic year. The lectures held before Christmas are likely to remain online, but we're hoping to return to in-person events from the new year onwards. So apologies that we can't be together this evening. My name is Nick Gallant, and I'm a professor here at UCL, and I will chair this evening's event. So these public lectures, we hold them every year. They're intended to bring together leading international thinkers and practitioners on topics related to planning and the built environment before an audience of colleagues, students, and guests. This is the first lecture of this year's series, and I'll introduce the speaker in a moment. But in addition to tonight's lecture, the programme for the rest of the year will include Professor Margaret Crawford from the University of California, Berkeley, who will share her work on everyday urbanism, Maria Adebowale-Schwartz from the Foundation for London, speaking on placemaking in London. Those of you who attended the events last year will remember that Maria was not able to speak and postponed her contribution to this current year. We'll also hear from Professor Isabel Angelovsky from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona on a topic linked to environmental justice. And then finally, at the end of May 2022, we'll hear from Professor Sharon Zukin from Brooklyn College and the City University of New York's Graduate Center, who will give this year's Sir Peter Hall lecture, presenting her recent work on the innovation complex, cities, tech, and the new economy. Details of these lectures can be found on our website, so take a look, and we will post the booking arrangements for events around about a month before each one is due to happen. It's been our custom on these occasions to offer you some hospitality, usually made available at the South Cloisters at UCL. Again, that's not going to be possible this time round because of the current COVID situation, but we hope that we'll be able to return to that practice after Christmas. So let me now introduce our speaker for this evening. Professor John Tomaney is a local lad based here at the Bartlett School of Planning, UCL. John is a professor of urban and regional planning. He joined the staff of BSP 9 years ago in 2012. And prior to that, he was Henry Dyche Professor of Regional Development and Director of the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University. John's research is mainly concerned with the development of cities and regions as socio-economic, political and cultural phenomena, and the role of public policy in the management of these. His work focuses on the governance of local and regional economies and the role of spatial planning therein. Recently, he's been a member of the UK 2070 Commission, chaired by Lord Kerslake, which investigated regional inequalities in the UK. John is also a trustee of Red Hills, the Durham Miners Hall. The subject of his lecture for this evening is social infrastructure and left behind places, stories from County Durham. There will be an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions at the end of the lecture. These can either be typed into the Q&A, not the chat function, the Q&A please, or we may well be able to unmute you if the technology allows, so that you can ask the questions to John directly. So without further ado, over to John.
Thank you, Nick. Let me share my screen here. Okay, thank you very much, Nick, for those words of introduction and for the invitation to give this lecture. I know very well that these invitations are issued sparingly, so I'm honoured. What I'd like to do this evening is report on work conducted with colleagues at UCL on the topic of left behind places. This is a problematic term, but one that is now widely used in the UK in media and political debates about regional inequalities. So the first part of this lecture explores what we mean by this term and how it's understood and why we're interested in it. It also briefly introduces some concepts we found useful in our work on this topic. But the main focus this evening is on the concept of social infrastructure. The main part of the lecture focuses on not on concepts and ideas as such, but on telling a story or some stories that arise from our work in County Durham. And I'll offer some brief conclusions which hopefully make some connections between the concepts that we're interested in and the stories that we've told. Now, the context for this lecture really is the debate about levelling up, I guess, which is in the news as a result of yesterday's budget. But I don't really want to focus on these policy issues in a direct way today, partly because I've written several papers and given several talks on this topic recently. And as Nick mentioned, I was involved in the UK 2070 Commission chaired by Lord Kerslake, which covered this ground in a lot of detail. I want to step back from current policy controversies today and take a larger view of these issues. I know that some folk from County Durham were planning to be here this evening, so I hope I do justice to their stories. If I don't do justice to them, I'm sure I'll hear about it. Just a word about the research team. I'm not going to introduce everybody, but to say that there's a group of researchers who are active in this field, whose work I'm going to draw upon this evening. They're primarily linked with the Bartlett, but also with other schools in UCL, with the exception of Maeve Blackman, who's based in Red Hills, the Miners Hall in Durham, and is working with us on this project. I should also acknowledge our sponsors. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I think this is an appropriate occasion to acknowledge the contribution of UCL grant challenges to the work that we've done, which has been crucial really in getting us underway, and I should express my thanks in that respect. So left behind, it's a term I've used several times already. What do we mean by it? Well, a useful place to start is this lecture, issue of The Economist, which was published in 2017. And as you can see here, the notion of left behind is attributed to places hurt by globalization. Now, it's not a coincidence that The Economist, the house magazine of international capitalism, if you like, is interested in this issue in 2017, because in the year before, two seismic political events had occurred. First of all, the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States by a complex coalition, but a key component of which was those places in the United States which had not benefited from economic growth and prosperity. Using the language that's commonplace in the US, these were the Rust Belt states, traditional Democrat supporting states which moved behind Trump, who gave voice to their grievances. And the other big event, of course, closer to home, was Brexit. And again, a complex story, but a key component of which was the concentration of the Leave vote in places which had higher levels of socioeconomic deprivation. So it's on the back of this kind of political interest, if you like, and political events that the issue of left behind places is gaining greater attention. And it's not just attention from the media. There's a growing academic debate on this. So this figure here simply shows word frequencies derived from Google Ngram, which examines a huge corpus of publications, and it shows the rapid use of the term left behind in a range of literature, particularly from 2016 onwards. So this is an issue which is attracting more and more attention And this tension is not just restricted to the Anglophone world. We see versions of this story playing out in different countries. So for instance, here on the left-hand side of this slide, we see the pattern of defined declining inner areas of Italy. So these are areas typically in the mountains, as we can see following the ridge of the Apennines here, places which have high levels of socioeconomic deprivation in Italian context, and often declining populations. And this pattern of disadvantage overlays the traditional north-south divide that we know about in Italy. And in the right-hand image, what we see is a representation of La France périphérique, peripheral France. And this figure here shows, I've forgotten what this figure shows. It shows disposable income, average disposable income in France by place in 2013. So the blue areas are places which are seeing their average disposable income rise. The red places are places which are seeing a decline. And in France, this process plays out really in terms of a cities versus rural areas debate. And this was part of the context for the Gilets jaunes explosion of protests which occurred in 2018 in France. This was presented at least as the cry of pain from the rural areas against a disinterested metropolitan France. So there are variations of this debate, differences in language obviously, around the world. And in Britain, we have increasing efforts to measure this problem of left behindness, if we want to call it that. This is a nice map produced by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which shows that left behind places are found across the country, but are concentrated in large towns and cities outside of London in the southeast, former industrial regions such as the northeast, the red block in the northeast corner of England on this map, which I'll talk about, and coastal and isolated rural areas. So that's not to say there aren't left behind places in the south. We could pick them out in Essex and North Kent and the Isle of Wight, but the concentration of these places is in the north of England. And my colleague and co-author at LSE, Andres Rodriguez Pose, has linked the emergence of left behind places to the rise of what he calls populist politics across Europe. So a range of often right-wing but occasionally left-wing populist parties emerging, which to give expression to the grievances of these places. And events such as Brexit and the election of Trump, according to this analysis by Andres, represent the revenge of the places that don't matter. So places which have felt neglected and left behind by economic change are finding ways of articulating their grievances through these different populist political parties, which we can see springing up all over Europe. In the English context, what we have is efforts to understand left behind places. In this interesting book by Deborah Mattinson explores the so-called Red Wall. These are the seats which had traditionally voted Labour but voted Conservative in the 2019 general election. And Mattinson attributes these shifts in political allegiances in the Midlands and North to a sense of loss and resentment arising from relative economic decline and a feeling of neglect. And often the loss of local industries at the heart of this, and people often describe the loss of these industries using the language of grief. And they they're concerned with the constrained opportunities that exist in small towns. And often a lot of attention focuses on the decline of high streets and these kinds of things. And interestingly, she points out that many of their complaints are directed at the local Labour Council rather than the sort of 10 years of, let's call it, Tory austerity, which preceded it, or perhaps less than 10 years. But the corollary of loss in these places, in these left behind towns, according to Mattinson, is a passionate sense of belonging. So she spent some time in Stoke and talks about how Stoke has a proud past that its people very much regard as their own history. And she talks about how there's a tradition among people from Stoke that if you go abroad and you sit down at a table in a restaurant or whatever, the first thing you do is flip the plate over to see where the plate was made, because Stoke was the heartland of the English pottery industry. So there's a complex set of economic and identity issues at work in all of this. So that's some of the background. Let me say something now about the contexts, concepts, and methods that we're using to explore these issues before coming on to my stories. So the context is, in the UK, we have deep and long-standing local and regional inequalities. These problems didn't emerge after 2016 or even after 2010 in austerity. In some places, they've been brewing for a very long time indeed. And that's a theme of what I want to say just now. Levelling up provides a context for why we're doing this work, but it's not the focus of the remarks this evening. And there are a number of policy challenges, and I'm not necessarily focusing directly on those this evening. So 3 concepts we've found useful to help us explain our story are, first of all, the notion of the foundational economy, an interesting body of research which has emerged in recent years, which argues that the basic sectors of the economy that make civilized life possible have been neglected by policymakers. What's being referred to here is the material infrastructure of everyday life, pipes and cables, utility distribution systems, retail banking, etc., and so-called providential services, education, care, income, maintenance, and so on. Now, in recent times, these services, these foundations of the local economy have been subject to privatization, deregulation, rationalization, in the name of efficiency. But what this has meant for many of these left behind places in particular is the deterioration of these foundations of the local economy. The conventional focus of local economic development is on attracting high-tech firms or establishing universities or creating free ports. You've heard all about this in the last couple of days, but these simply do not address the problems of many left behind places because they're problems that are to do with the nature of the foundational economy. But the COVID pandemic has illustrated how this foundational economy is really, really important, and why we've pursued this agenda of efficiency. In reality, this foundational economy is necessary for the resilience of communities. So this is why we think this is an interesting and important perspective. There are a number of cognate perspectives. My colleague here at UCL, Henrietta Moores, talks about universal basic services, shared prosperity, and so on. So there's lots of interesting ideas in this space that we're exploring. Secondly, we're very interested in the importance of belonging and attachment, the bonds that people feel towards the place in which they live, and which we believe contribute to the production of social capital. That's the trust, the ways of working together, and so on, which are crucial for local development. And finally, the concept I'm going to pay most attention to just now, social infrastructure, the physical places and organizations that shape the way people interact and within which social capital is accumulated. Now, in doing this work, we're trying to work closely with the communities that are the subject of our study, and to produce solutions together with them. And I'll say a bit more about that later. So a quick word about social infrastructure. Social infrastructure is a coming idea, if you like. More and more literature emerging on this subject, but one way into it is to look at the book by Klinenberg, Palaces for People, which was published a couple of years ago. So Klinenberg, out of New York University, talks about social infrastructure as the physical places and organizations that shape the way people interact and within which social capital develops. He argues that this represents a critical element of the health of the built environment in local communities. And if it's eroded, that has implications for the health of local communities. By social infrastructure, he means things like public libraries. Indeed, his book talks a lot about public libraries in the US, schools, playgrounds, parks, sports facilities, but also less tangible things like well-designed pavements and community gardens, shared green spaces, physical spaces where people can gather and converse civilly. And his argument, using largely US evidence, is that we are now coming to terms with how much damage deindustrialization and the decline of blue-collar communities has done to the body politic, and how fractured and distrustful we have become. So we're living in an increasingly individualized and atomized society. As I say, he draws on largely US evidence, so we're interested in exploring these ideas in a UK context. And there is growing interest in social infrastructure in the UK. Across England, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed health inequalities, food poverty, absence of green spaces, endemic loneliness, all of which I would argue are largely absent in the levelling up agenda. And interestingly, a surveyation poll published earlier this year identified places to meet and other common facilities which bring people together as a top priority in left behind places. So there's an emerging body of literature on this, particularly grey literature, which we're delving into. And indeed, there's a large amount of what I call here think tankery that measures, quantifies, and indexes social infrastructure. And while this is valuable, we think there's a need for as well as this, there's the need for historical and qualitative understandings of these developments. So that's the end of the academic theories, and let's tell the story now. I'm going to tell the story about one village in County Durham. It's called Sacriston, which I think it's looking rather fetching here in the snow. And we're doing in Sacriston what we grandly call a deep place study, which draws on a range of quantitative and qualitative methods and data visualization, includes things like focus groups, archival and oral history. And we're tracing history of social infrastructure in this village to understand how it developed over the long run. Now, the thing about Sacriston that you need to know is that before 1839, it didn't exist. It owes its existence to the discovery of a coal seam there, the Victoria seam, which led to the construction of a coal mine. And that coal mine has shaped life in this village over the last century, and it closed in 1985. So here's the colliery in 1920. This was when it was pretty much at peak production, or the Durham coalfield was at peak production. Mining in County Durham was of a very particular kind. It was very arduous work. It was difficult. It was dirty. It was dangerous, and it was frequently deadly. So this representation by the artist Vin Talbot it gives a very good indication of what it was like to work in Sacriston Colliery through most of its history. So the colliery was closed in 1985, and I included this portrait here because it's the portrait of more or less the last man out of Sacriston Colliery, and this portrait is of Gus Tomaney, my uncle. So the sinking of the pit created a new workplace. Throughout the middle of the 19th century, there was a struggle in County Durham to establish a trade union, the Durham Miners Association, and there was a local lodge of this Durham Miners Association in Sacriston. It was the most important institution in the village, and here we see the miners and the lodge officials parading their banner along with the Sacriston Colliery Band sometime in the 1930s, probably in anticipation of visiting the Durham Miners Gala, the big gathering of the mining communities that takes place on the first Saturday of July in Durham every year. Now, the lodge was an important institution, and this was a male-dominated industry, of course, and its tentacles extended well beyond the pit into the wider society. So this is a village which grew rapidly. So here we see the colliery on the northern edge of the village, and we see also the beginnings of a village in the form of a set of colliery house rows. And this is the first map of Sacriston from 1857. And what we see is already social infrastructure has been built. Inevitably, there's a pub called the Colliery Inn, but also there's a primitive Methodist chapel. The primitive Methodists were a radical Protestant sect who came to the village and were very influential in the trade union. And the first thing they did was build a chapel. And also we see a school, the first school in the village. So the village grew over time from the small beginnings around 1860. It expanded dramatically during the late 19th century and took the form that it adopted throughout the 20th century, around about 1920, this peak moment that I mentioned earlier. We see some slow expansion of the village during the 1950s and 70s, mainly in the form of the building of a large council estate. And the village takes its present form more or less by 1990, although there's some recent additions I'll talk about in a moment. So the village is growing during this time as the colliery expands and the demand for labour grows. So Sacriston emerges as a community. One way of charting the growth of this place is through business directories. So this is Kelly's Directory of Durham for 1898. And what it shows is already there's a boom in social infrastructure building, particularly religious infrastructure, but also social infrastructure in the form of shops and other services, which are contributing to the development of the community. By 1914, this has expanded enormously, a key moment, I think, in the development of the village in terms of social infrastructure occurs with the opening of at the end of the 19th century of the Anfield Plain, of a local branch of the Anfield Plain Industrial Cooperative Society. So this was a local co-op organisation set up principally by miners, which opened branches in Sacriston and neighbouring villages. And this was a major addition to both the retail sector and the social infrastructure of this small village. This is the co-op shortly after it was opened. Here's a report from the Builder magazine, really describing the opulence of this building at the time when it was opened in 1897. The upstairs contained a hall which could accommodate 700 persons. I don't suppose they had modern day health and safety rules to limit those sorts of numbers. But what we see is what this represented was really a massive addition to the quality of retail in the village. It was it was by far the most prominent building in the village after the churches, and it became a centre in many ways of village life. Durham was a place which had a very high level of membership of cooperative societies, a membership that was twice the rate of the southeast of England. And I suspect in Sacriston, the levels were even higher than the Durham average in terms of membership of the co-op. So everybody shopped at the co-op, and everybody had a share in its success. Other things that were happening in the village along similar lines were the opening of cottages for retired miners by the Durham Aged Mine Workers Homes Association, which was established at the end of the 19th century. Previously, people who lived in houses owned by the colliery company had to leave those houses when they retired. So the idea was that you would build cottages in which retired miners could see out and families could see out their later years. These cottages still exist in the village, and the Durham Aged Mine Workers Homes Association is still a very important provider of social housing in County Durham. The framework for all of these developments, the union, the co-op, the aged miners' homes, was the rise of the Labour Party. It provided a connective tissue to all of these activities. Lots of ways to tell this story in County Durham, but I'm going to tell it through the story of one person, Annie Errington, an extraordinary woman who lived from 1882 to 1959. She was inevitably a Sacriston miner's wife. Her husband was an official at in the lodge at Sacriston Colliery. But she was a leading figure in the Durham Federation of Labour Women in the interwar period. This was a male-dominated society, a very strict division of labour in the workplace, but it was also a place, little known, that had a mass working class women's movement in the interwar period. Among the many extraordinary things Annie Errington did in her life was to visit the USSR in 1926 to win support for the miners in the big conflict they were having with the coal owners at that time. And indeed, so notorious was this visit that a public meeting was held by the local Tories in Durham Town Hall to attack her. This was widely reported in the local press. You can follow this story in detail in the newspaper archives. And it has to be said that I think probably before she left for the USSR, she'd never left County Durham. She was elected one of the Chesterley Street Poor Law Guardians, who was surcharged by for making overgenerous payments to striking miners and threatened with imprisonment. She narrowly escaped that when her surcharge was paid by others. But she was later elected first to Chesterley Street Rural District Council and then Durham County Council and appointed at JP in 1938. So in this extraordinary interwar period, what we have is this woman moving from being being described as an insurrectionist in the local press to being a pillar of the local community. And the Labour Party rose off the back of these cooperative efforts in the lodge, in the union, and in institutions like the Aged Miners Homes Association. And here's the Sacriston Women's Section parading their banner, I think at the Durham Miners Gala sometime in the 1930s. And at the wider county scale, Durham County Council became the first Labour County Council in the country, and it remained a Labour County Council until this year. Peter Lee was the outstanding Labour figure during this time. He was simultaneously leader of the Durham Miners, leader of the County Council, and inevitably in County Durham, a primitive Methodist preacher. And the Labour-controlled Durham County Council pioneered extraordinary improvements in areas like water, sanitation, education, public health, hospitals. It built council houses at twice the national rate, reduced infant mortality at a faster rate than the national rate, and it effectively, through such as the building of this reservoir in Upper Weardale, constructed the foundational or everyday economy and presided over an extraordinary advance in local living standards. And this consolidated the position of the local Labour Party in the community. So how do we assess this story just now? Because I'm going to turn a page in a moment. Well, one way to look at it is to go back to what was being written by people who were around at that time. So the great Northeast miner novelist Sid Chaplin, writing in 1978, reflecting on growing up during this interwar period in County Durham, argued that each village was, in fact, a sort of self-constructed, do-it-yourself counter-environment. The people had built it themselves. So the co-op was built out of the money of the local people. The chapels and churches were built through contributions from the miners who followed that particular confessional faith. So the Catholic Church was built by the Catholic miners who arrived from County Galway in the 1880s, etc. And the American sociologist Mark Benny, in his book about East Tantope, which I think is meant to refer to East Stanley, which is a village very near Sacriston, talks about how the welfare institutes and the stores are the outstanding institutional buildings in these villages. But nothing has come easily to this village. When it felt the need, it tried to supply it for itself. The people had built the institutions themselves or struggled for through their union. So this idea that this is a self-constructed social infrastructure and an effort to build a foundational economy is the lesson I take from all of this. So if we go back to 1915, this key moment, what we see is this extraordinary provision of social infrastructure, which had been created in very short order. So we see the Methodist Church, we see the Catholic Church, we see the Anglican Church. The Anglicans came late. They were quickly out. They were responding to, as it were, the threat, if you like, of these new denominations. So the Catholics arrived en masse from Galway. An Irish-speaking priest was sent to keep an eye on them, and they very quickly got their church, their presbytery, and their school built. So there's also a Salvation Army citadel in the village. There's a literary institute in the village, effectively a library. There's a working men's club. There's leisure facilities like football grounds. There's schools being built, both by the government under pressure, local pressure, but also by the different churches. And as the collective infrastructure provided locally by the Chesley Street Rural District Council is increasingly under the control of Labour. And here we see a privately owned reservoir, but don't be fooled by that. By 1921, that had been municipalised by Peter Lee and turned into the Durham County Water Board after a series of failures by the private sector to provide clean water on a regular basis to the villagers. And finally, there's the co-op, which I showed you earlier on Plowsworth Road. But all this changed, really. A key moment came in the history of this village when something that the village had wanted for a long time actually happened. In 1945, a Labour government was elected on a manifesto to create the welfare state. And what this meant in practice was both the modernisation and centralisation of these collective services after 1945. So services like education, health, utilities, etc., which had been locally controlled, were taken into the hands of central government. And of course, after 1979, many of these local services, which had been under government control, were privatised. So this was an era of rising living standards, but it was also an era in which local control over the economy, over the foundational activities and over social infrastructure was seeping away from the village. Of course, these changes were embedded in larger or broader social, cultural and technological changes. But I think this is a key part of the story, which is often neglected in thinking about left behind places. Nationalisation of the coal industry, long-standing demand of the miners, came about in 1947, and it certainly led to improvements, for instance, in wages and safety, but also finally the mechanisation of the workforce, the rundown of the industry from the 1960s onwards. So nationalisation in the end was the mechanism by which the coal industry was closed, not saved. And the Sacriston pit was slated for closure on several occasions before finally succumbing. It was the last of the inland pits in Durham to close following the miners' strike. So pit closures been occurring in Durham for a long time, from the 60s onwards. And so so what this has left is this particularly distinctive pattern of left behindness, if you like, in Durham, where it's concentrated in villages scattered across the county. So this figure shows the darkly coloured places are the most income deprived places in England, and we see they're scattered across the villages of County Durham. There's an area of prosperity around Durham with its university, its hospitals, and so on. But this is a place of scattered left behind communities, of which Sacriston is one. And what does this mean in practice? Well, lots of things. It means problems in the housing market. So this is a classic of the genre from the Daily Mail, not somewhere I normally go for my evidence, but here's a house on Findon Hill in Sacriston, which was sold for £1. Obviously, it's in poor condition, but the idea is, please someone take it and improve it. My guess would be that this was bought by a private landlord who spent a small amount of money upgrading it, rented it out, and is probably getting a yield of around 10% on his investment. Another part of the story in this context is problems of crime and antisocial behaviour. And here's a sad picture of the co-op, that grand piece of social infrastructure, which is looking very dilapidated in this picture here. So in the work that we've done on using focus groups and oral history, what we find is a complex story of change. Certainly a sense of loss of the type that Mattinson finds, but alongside some changes which are welcomed. It's acknowledged that the pit provided a focus for village identity among local people and comparatively highly paid employment for men, or many men, and relative prosperity for the village. But in the aftermath of its closure, there were shop, pubs, school closures, all of which fed a sense of decline, a loss of vibrancy. Now, work, socialisation and childcare were highly gendered in this community, but still, in this context, there were many opportunities for conviviality which are now absent. People recognise material gains like central heating, carpeted houses, consumer goods, and so on, and they recognise new opportunities for women as the economy shifted towards services. But these are largely beyond the village, and they occur in the context of declining living standards and growing precarity in the workforce. So people are very ambivalent about a lot of these changes, even where they, on the face of it, could look positive. There's certainly long-term unemployment in the village, entrenching disengagement and the decline of social capital. But there's a strong sense of belonging and resilience that was revealed during the pandemic as community groups filled the gaps left by austerity in a shrinking local state. It's quite extraordinary the way the village kicked in to meet needs that were being unmet in the village during this time. And it was described to us by a local head teacher as mining DNA. These are communities which are used to setbacks and difficulties, and they know how to respond to them. Now, not everybody in the village is connected in the way that I'm describing. There are new estates on the periphery, and there are certainly problems of isolation, loneliness, and, as I've said, antisocial behaviour. And we've written a report about this, which I've referenced here. So on the one hand, the traditional identity of the village gets expressed every year at the Durham Miners Gala, where the Sacriston Lodge banner is paraded by the local banner group, which preserves this tradition. And 100,000 people turn up to this event which is a great spectacle every year of bands, banners, and just general jollity. So the traditional identities are still very important. But also, this is a village where recently a new housing estate was built on the edge. And these prices might look extraordinarily modest to people in London, but are actually beyond the means of many people who live in the village. And what existing villages tell us is that this new estate is poorly connected to the village. It's on the edge, and people who live in it don't necessarily integrate or interact much with the village. So there are new tensions emerging around this. And what Sacriston is left with in 2021 is a kind of denuded social infrastructure. And we're in the business of charting and mapping this now and considering what can be done with the social infrastructure that remains. So for instance, the old church there, St. Peter's, the Anglican church, is no longer used for Anglican worship. It stands empty. What could you do with that? Now, one extraordinarily positive story emerging from Sacriston is this one, and it's what's happened to the local co-op, that building which had a fantastic origins and went into decline. And what's happened here is a group of local people have come together to take over and reuse the co-op, put it to other uses. So this is Heather Little, one of the people who are involved in this, and she's one of the leaders of the Sacriston Youth Project. This is a picture from a little while ago. They've taken over this unit within the co-op, and they use this to provide, they've had it refurbished. They've raised the money to refurbish this thing, and they just recently reopened it, and it's looking fantastic. And they use this to provide free out of school care for parents who couldn't otherwise afford it, but need it if they're going to access jobs. And so they provide summer camps for kids, after school activities. And this is often doing things like teaching kids to cook healthy meals and so on. So this is an extraordinarily positive development. Another very positive development is that next door, in another unit in the co-op, is this amazing enterprise led by Nathan Hopkins here on the right. And this is the Sacriston Wood Workshop, and what they do in this workshop is they take kids who are struggling at school, perhaps causing problems, and bring them in and train them in woodworking skills, and try and set them on the right track. And so alongside this kind of training operation, they've got a social enterprise which sells the material, sells the goods they make, and upgrade and upcycle in this workshop. And this is fantastic, entirely bottom-up development, which has been supported by the local council and others, but which has often had to overcome extraordinarily obstacles in order to produce this change. And I think these are the sparks of the reuse of the existing built environment to provide new social infrastructure. And these are really inspiring examples and really inspiring people, but there are other examples across County Durham that we're aware of and interested in. So moving towards a conclusion then, in order that I stick to time. What we have here are a set of opportunities and barriers that face the effort to reconstruct the social infrastructure which was crucial to life in this village. Now, what we saw yesterday, I think, in the budget, and what we hear from government ministers, is a set of centralised solutions, often in the form of various challenge funds. So, for instance, Rishi Sunak today was in Bury, announcing that he was going to give some money to fix Bury Market, which in itself is a good thing. He rather blotted his copybook by referring to it as Burnley Market throughout his announcement. But nevertheless, what this reveals is the idea that somehow central government, civil servants in Whitehall can hand out the goodies on this, in these small penny packets to these communities. But centralized solutions like this will struggle, I think, against the diversity and complexity of left behind places. Handing out money for hanging baskets is not going to be enough. There's real dynamism in these villages, led by the villagers themselves, and somehow or other their lives have got to be made easier in presenting what are real solutions to the real problems that have been identified locally. Questions of identity and belonging are really crucial here. No one expects the pits to come back. No one wants them to come back. No one wants their children to work underground. But no one wants their history and identity trashed either. And that's why I think things like the banner groups persist. So Klinenberg, in his assessment of all of this, argues that the integrated blue-collar community may no longer be a viable model for large-scale development. I agree, we're not going to recreate Sacriston of 1920, but there are exemplary forms of social infrastructure, some small scale, some large, some relatively new, that suggest better ways to work and live together. And I think we're finding those in County Durham. They're entirely constructed locally, often in the face of great difficulty, and the people who are producing these changes are genuine local heroes. And Andy Haldane, in his previous role as chief economist at the Bank of England, was one of the first onto this when he argued that strengthening the infrastructure that underpins the social sector and embedding for good the new model army of volunteers that the COVID crisis has spawned is a key priority. And this is not a replacement for local government. This is not handing over responsibility for social problems to society and the state divesting its responsibilities. This is a role for the state in helping people who are helping themselves to do it much more easily and much better. So that's my stories from County Durham. That's my linking of these issues back to the concepts that I talked about earlier. And I will leave you with this picture of the Sacriston Primitive Methodist Chapel Choir on their outing in 1900. And that's me done.
Okay, John, thank you. Thank you very much for the talk, and thank you very much for sticking to time. I had a few questions, but you actually answered them all at the end. So that's a mark of a brilliant talk. I just wondered, actually, a lot of these community projects are going on in Sacriston, and you've said that, you know, this is a self-constructed community in many respects that built its own infrastructure. So government's top-down interventions seem to be, you know, largely inappropriate, although they can come out with some cash, and maybe it's possible that they will be able to seed and support those local innovations, those local activities. But as the community itself worked with any national bodies such as the Plunkett Foundation on trying to, you know, source the means to bring some of this social infrastructure back online?
Yes, they have, you know, and I think, you know, what we're talking about here are genuine social entrepreneurs who are doing this. So I'll take the example of the Sacriston Youth Project, which I mentioned. They have much of what they've done recently has been funded by the JD Sports Foundation, which have been very supportive of the efforts to refurbish the unit and provide all the facilities which is needed by you know, in order to make the activities work really. And what I guess what people like Heather in Sacriston would say is that working with the JD Sports Foundation has been a bit of a joy, really. They're flexible, they're responsive, they understand, they listen, and they provide you with very quick solutions. And they've sent their own workforce, their own contractors to refurbish that unit, which I showed in the slide. You know, all the rewiring and plumbing and everything's been done. It's absolutely pristine now. They've also they've also provided revenue support, which is important because you don't just need capital grants to refurbish buildings, you need ongoing support. Even if much of this is being run by volunteers, there's costs associated with this. And finally, what they've done on a couple of occasions is supplied sporting equipment, including, for instance, a whole batch of high quality cricket bats, which were no use to the Sacriston Youth Project, but we're extremely useful to the very successful Sacriston Cricket Club, which is just down the road, and which is another key part of the social infrastructure, and was the location where the food bank operated during the COVID crisis. So there's a kind of rich ecology of all of this stuff going on in Sacriston, and the people in it have become very adept at finding the resources. So behind the Sacriston Youth Project, in the old stables belonging to the co-op, there's a kind of gym being created. That's using money from Sport England. And the last time I was there, down below, toddlers were being entertained while their mothers had an exercise class upstairs. So this is all done by local people, but it does need external resource and support. Yeah. And what people in the village and other villages are telling us is that it's often through these foundations and so on that the support comes in the kind of flexible, timely way that they need, really. And whereas coming from central and local government, it often comes in ways which is very difficult to use and meet the needs of the community. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, John, I think you've argued really that the social capital survives. Mm-hmm. The interactional social infrastructure has declined to some extent, has been lacking. We're bringing it back online now. So really, with regards to social infrastructure and social capital, there's a sort of chicken and egg sort of question. Mm. And I've got that chicken and egg question from, if I can pronounce his name correctly, Emmanuel Tranos, who mm-hmm. says, "Thank you, John, fascinating. What I see here is that social capital survived the decline of social infrastructure. And at the end, it was the driving force to rebuild it. Does that mean that social capital is independent to some extent from social infrastructure? How does that relationship work?"
Yeah, I think it's a complex interrelationship. I would say that social capital has survived in the village. There's a high level of cooperation, for instance, between all the people who are involved in the different projects in the co-op. They're very close. They share. They help each other. They give advice and so on. And these are people who live in the village or in the next village or whatever. And so someone like Heather is the daughter of a miner at Sacriston Pit. So some of these messages are being passed down through the generations, I guess. But I would say social capital is denuded. And that's you see expressions of that in some of the antisocial behaviour that goes on in the village. Some of this wouldn't have happened 50 years ago, but it's happening now, and that suggests to me that some of this social capital is fraying. So, but I think we need spaces within which to accumulate this capital, and this you can see this every time you go to Sacriston and go to the co-op. You can see this social capital accumulating. You can see the local policeman popping in and saying, "Oh, there's a lad causing a bit of bother in the village. Is any chance we could get them into the workshop and get them messing about with saws, and that so or chisels or things like that." And that's happening. That is real. You can see it before your eyes, the accumulation of the social capital in this sense. So you need spaces within which this can happen. They're creating these spaces, basically. They're creating these spaces, but they're doing it drawing on resources that have been run down, I would argue. And it's a critical moment. You can either help this stuff go forward, local government and national government can enable it, or it can make it struggle. And I think that's the situation here. And what I think the current government likes is handing out capital projects, fix the roof of Bury/Burnley Market, but that's not enough. There needs to be ongoing support for the activities which take place in these buildings, if you like.
Okay, thanks, John. I think I've just.
And by the way, say hello, Manolis. Yeah.
I think I've just deleted somebody's question. Hopefully, Vicky can bring it back. I have another question from John Denham.
Yeah.
And this really follows on from the conversation we've been having about funding and about seed corn. Is the core issue one of funding, or of enabling local leadership to flourish? If so, what are the obstacles other than funding to that leadership developing?
Hello, John. John knows more about this than most. He was a minister in the last Labour government who oversaw some of this kind of activity back in the day. Yeah, I think it's not a question of either funding or leadership. I think, again, it's the relationship between these things which is important. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn when I say, Heather no doubt will tell us off if I get it wrong, but sometimes I think it's been a real struggle on the part of local people to get, for instance, the local council interested in what they're trying to do in the village. And that's not because people in the council don't necessarily value it or want it to fail. It's just that their systems do not enable things to happen in the bottom-up way. They have to fit in to the structures and procedures of bureaucratic organisations. And to some extent, that's inevitable. But there's definitely actions that could be taken to remove some of those institutional, bureaucratic, technical obstacles to things. And the people in Sacriston will have some fantastic stories about some of the things some of the hoops they had to jump through, which they still don't understand why, in order to progress things. These people in the village are leaders. They're making. We know that because they're making things happen. But they're not necessarily the sort of people. Well, they're the sort of people who ought to be stepping forward to stand for the council, but who don't see that as really the best place for their energies. They think it's, they think that, I'm not even suggesting that these people themselves would describe themselves as leaders. I'm not, and I hope I'm not embarrassing them by using this kind of language. I'm just saying that they're acting like leaders in making things happen in their village. And there are lots of ways in which that could be enabled by more flexible, more outward-looking forms of, let's say, a local government. And it's interesting that it's outside of the official channels where the most support seems to be available to these organisations. So that's my take on it. Leadership is extremely important, but it's also a difficult. It's a mercurial thing. You can't quite put your finger on what it is and how it happens. There are certainly leaders in County Durham, I think, in the villages, but it's a very self-effacing kind of leadership. They just get on and do it. They're not looking for honours and adulation. That's my impression anyway. They just think there are problems which need to be solved in their villages.
Okay, thanks for that, John. I've got a question from Ben Hughes that I think you've just answered, actually. You've been talking about the rigidity of existing structures and that people find it difficult to fit in with them. They may look to voluntary agencies and what that are more flexible as a source of support. But Ben asks, is part of the solution finding ways of co-creating with the state? I think that's the element you were touching on. Yes. In more of a power sharing way. This may help stimulate new wealth building initiatives, similar to the successful approach taken in Preston. I don't know if you're familiar with the approach taken in Preston, but I'm hoping that you are and that you can reflect on that.
I'm not an expert on Preston. I've read a bit about it, so I probably, I fear I may be up against an expert on Preston, so I'll not say much about Preston. But I think the general point is a good one. So if you look at New Local, the think tank, which deals with some of these sorts of, which is interested in these sorts of issues, they talked about the need to create enabling councils which are not concerned with hoarding and exercising power, even if it's quite denuded these days after lots of austerity, but instead see their role as enabling things to happen in communities. And I think there's a lot in that. I think that there's potentially a good model. The critics object that this is a way of councils offloading their responsibilities to hard-pressed communities. And there's dangers in it. I would acknowledge that. But I think you can't deny that across County Durham and other places, no doubt, this is just our story. There are highly dynamic people who are making a difference, and we need forms of governance and policy which make their lives easier, not harder. And so the concept of enabling local government, I think, is timely, really. But at the same time, we have to avoid the situation where the state denies its responsibilities to these places. I think that's the tension that we need to avoid.
John, there's a lot of work in my own field on infrastructure, interactional infrastructure in rural development. I mean, everybody talks about the importance of post offices, pubs, village halls as places where people get together, they share ideas, but the networks are built, and within those networks, social capital inheres. I mean, what you seem to have been arguing tonight is that this is something that has to happen endogenously within communities. The state is if you like, something that is too rigid, that solutions have to be born from the bottom up. But you only mentioned one piece of literature, and this was the book, the 2019 book that I can't remember the name of the author of, actually.
Klinenberg.
Yeah. So have you been inspired by a broader sort of range of literature?
Oh yeah.
I know you write on belonging and close attachment, so.
Yes. I mean, obviously, there is a much wider literature. I just picked on Klinenberg because I think it's a very accessible way into this literature if you want to follow it up. But there's there's a massive proliferation of reports which I'm wading through about, much of it quantifying the rise and decline and all of this sort of thing. Yeah. And while this is all very valuable and important, and I'm certainly not against it, and I've contributed to that kind of stuff myself in the past, what I think that is what we wanted to do was tell a richer story about what actually happens in places, as opposed to averaging out and indexing these human experiences. But there's some great stuff which I've read. So, for instance, there's a great piece came out of LSE recently. I can't remember the name of the author, but she has written something looking at the decline of pubs in Britain and how that can be correlated. She's done a regression, and that can be correlated with the rise of far-right voting. So there's something going on in this space, and which we need to understand. But we're interested in possibly, we're interested in going to the closed pub and asking people what they think, as opposed to doing a regression. And that's what we feel is our contribution to this debate, really. But yeah, I agree. There's enormous literature, and there's a literature around loss and belonging and so on. The work of Peter Maris, I'm very taken with, who argues that we need to narrate our lives, and if our lives are disrupted in various ways, it can be experienced as a trauma that we can't narrate. And I there's a lot in all of that. So there's a body of literature around the foundational economy. I think there's some legitimate criticisms of that body of literature, but we find it useful to get us thinking about what's important and not in improving conditions in places like Sacriston.
So I was very excited by your focus on social infrastructure. It reminded me of work that I've read in Australia on declining, if decline is the right word, declining fishing and farming communities, and the importance of this sort of infrastructure to maintain the integrity of those communities and give them an opportunity to grow something new. In the face of decline. A lot of work by Sue Kilpatrick from the University of Tasmania in my own area, John, so in rural development. So I think there are lots of parallels. I mean, if we're having an internal conversation, we can talk about all the different linkages that stem.
Indeed, there are. There's a big issue in Australia about the decline of what they call regional Australia. There's a fantastic book about it by Gabrielle Chan called Rusted Off, which talked, it's in a way, it's a bit of an inspiration for what we're doing in Sacriston. She writes about the town she lives in New South Wales, which is an agricultural town, been through similar processes. And she says, well, what can we do? You find this all over the place. You find that, you know, there's interesting things going on in the inner areas promoted by Fabrizio Barca in Italy, and Barca's work is, you know, we can learn from that. So there's lots of this stuff going on. I mean, one of the tasks I think we should set ourselves is to perhaps be a clearinghouse for some of the thinking on this, because there's a lot elsewhere in UCL. The work of Henrietta Moore and others is really relevant to all of this. So we have some knowledge and expertise and international networks, and what we're trying to do in our project is put it to work in places where we think it could make a bit of a difference. And not that we're claiming to have the answers at all. I mean, the answers lie in Sacriston. You know, we don't have any of the answers. What we have are some techniques and knowledge and networks, and which we can make available to those communities. And partly doing this lecture, and I know that Heather and one or two others from Sacriston have been here tonight. You know, part of doing lectures like this is simply to tell their story and get a wider understanding from it.
John, thank you very much for your contribution this evening. A number of people have popped their notes expressing their gratitude for your talk in the chat. Some people have asked you for some of the references that you've cited this evening, and I think we can supply those afterwards. I'm actually suddenly, when I hadn't got any questions for a long while, suddenly getting a few more now. But I think I will bring the discussion to a close now. I know you have a pub appointment, if I'm allowed to say that, well-deserved drink tonight. Thank you very much for your contribution. If we were all together in the normal sort of venue, you would hear people cheering and whistling and what have you.
I fear not, Nick, I fear not. Yeah.
Well, you know I'm right. So John, thank you very much for your contribution tonight.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure, and thanks to Vicky, who's been the Wizard of Oz in the making it all happen for us. So thanks to Vicky.
Okay, John, thank you. So I'll see you soon.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.